Welcome back to the channel, the place where the stories you think you already know often turn out not quite that simple. Tonight, we begin with a legend so familiar that many people accept it as unquestionable fact. In the Middle Ages, everyone believed the earth was flat. Maybe you have seen it dropped casually in a comment thread, turned into a meme, or even slipped into a classroom summary. But now is the time to put that fact on the table, dust it off, and hold it up to the light of history. Picture this. You are inside a small monastery in England at the dawn of the 14th century. Outside, the wind whistles through a narrow window. Inside, candlelight flickers across a wooden table. A scribe bends over parchment, carefully copying a manuscript. On the margin, he draws a globe, not a floating disk resting on the ocean, but a sphere, complete with circles of latitude and longitude. In the corner, a cat curls up on the sill. From the courtyard comes the steady toll of a church bell. In this moment, if you watch closely, you will see knowledge passing quietly from one generation to the next. And no, he is not shocked by the idea of a round earth. For the educated of the Middle Ages, it was simply common sense. So why do we, centuries later, cling to the belief that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat? Because that story is convenient. It paints a sharp contrast, a dark, ignorant past versus a brilliant, enlightened present. It offers a clean, satisfying line, then versus now, wrong versus right. But history, as you already know, rarely fits into tidy boxes. It twists, it complicates, it resists simplicity, just like the uneven, bumpy surface of the planet itself. We begin tonight not just to correct a detail, but to practice a habit. Whenever you encounter a common fact, pause for 5 seconds and ask, where's the evidence? When was this story first told, and why has it survived so long? The Flat Earth legend is a perfect test case. When you follow the trail, you will uncover manuscripts, diagrams, maps, and debates showing that medieval scholars, monks, and mapmakers were perfectly comfortable with a round world. They were not terrified of falling off an edge. They were busy asking tougher questions: the structure of the cosmos, the motion of the planets, the placement of continents. In other words, they had bigger puzzles on their minds. Now you might ask, but what about ordinary people? Did they know the earth was round? The honest answer: knowledge was unevenly spread, depending on education, profession, and region. A farmer may not have cared much about geometry or astronomy, just as many people today do not really understand the math behind GPS satellites. But indifference is not the same as denial. And even if not everyone spoke in terms of latitudes and spheres, there is no evidence that entire societies genuinely believed in a pancake-shaped earth. Why then is the myth so attractive? Because it reassures us. It lets us believe progress is a straight upward climb. It flatters the modern ego. Look how far we have come compared to those backward people. But when the past is flattened into caricature, we lose its richest textures. The sharp debates, the bold experiments, the patient trial and error. And we also lose something else: respect for the people who laid the groundwork for so much of what we take for granted today. That is why I invite you not just to listen to information tonight, but to walk alongside the story. Treat each historical myth like an antique at a market stall. From a distance it looks polished and simple. But when you lift it to the light, you notice scratches, seams, and layers of paint. You start asking, where did this object come from? Who made it? Why does it still matter? Do that with myths like the flat earth, And suddenly history is not static. It becomes a conversation. And the better our questions, the richer the answers. Let us widen the lens for a moment. Step through a doorway in your imagination, and what do you see? Not the endless dark night of the Middle Ages Hollywood has sold us. Instead, bustling marketplaces with bright streamers overhead, pilgrims pinning badges to their cloaks, weaving workshops reeking of dye, students in crowded lecture halls arguing loudly about Aristotle. In the corner of a room, a wooden globe rests on a table beside a map, with jagged coastlines and compass roses. Now ask yourself honestly, if people believed the earth was flat, how do you explain that globe sitting right there? What is powerful here is not just the evidence itself, but the habit it teaches us. By peeling away the myth of the flat earth, we train ourselves to resist oversimplification. Online and fast-paced conversations, quick and catchy claims spread easily, but truth usually asks us to slow down, breathe, and look closer. When you give history that extra moment, it reveals its evidence, its logic, its wider context. The flat earth myth reminds us, do not let a convenient story shape your view of an entire era. And because this channel is for people who love layered, honest storytelling, let us set a ground rule from the beginning. We will respect evidence, respect complexity, and respect the people of the past as thinking human beings. They were not cardboard cutouts waiting to be mocked. They were writers, builders, skeptics, dreamers, problem solvers. Sometimes wrong, sometimes right, but always engaged with the mysteries of their world. And here's the twist. The more respect we give to their struggles, the sharper we become in handling our own. So lower the lights around you. Let the fan hum softly in the background. Tonight we will follow the traces left behind. Globes in manuscripts, maps in libraries, records of classroom debates, and as we peel back each layer, we will also ask, how did a myth invented centuries later manage to sneak backward in time and dominate our imagination? Who told that story? When? And to serve what larger narrative? Because sometimes the real secret is not buried in the Middle Ages. It is hiding in the lens we use to view them. If you are ready, then let us take the first step. There is no edge of the earth waiting for us to fall off. Only new horizons opening as we walk further. And when you look back, you will see that the flat earth claim was never more than a dried leaf at the doorway. Step past it, and you will find an entire garden of myths, each one waiting to be pruned, studied, and illuminated. From here on, the Middle Ages won't look like a dark corridor, but like a gallery, each painting full of color, texture, sound, and life. Let us open the first door together. So now that we have set the record straight about the Earth's shape, let us turn to another myth that sticks stubbornly in our collective imagination. People in the Middle Ages never bathed. You have probably heard this one too, that medieval villagers lived in filth, that nobles reeked under layers of perfume, that everyone was coated in grime from cradle to grave. It makes for a vivid mental picture, but once again, history is far more complicated and far more human. Let us slip back in time. Imagine stepping into a bustling medieval town on market day. Among the cries of merchants selling bread and the clang of blacksmiths, there is another sound you might not expect, the chatter of neighbors at the public bathhouse. Yes, public baths existed, and in many towns they were part of daily or weekly routines. Men, women, even entire families would gather, scrub down, share news, and sometimes enjoy a soak in heated pools. In places influenced by Roman traditions, like Southern Europe, The culture of bathing had deep roots. But if bathhouses existed, why do we think of the Middle Ages as the dirty years? Here's where context matters. Bathing customs were not the same everywhere, nor did they stay constant across the centuries. In certain periods, especially during outbreaks of the plague, attitudes toward bathing shifted dramatically. Some physicians believed that hot water opened the pores and made people more vulnerable to disease. So instead of a full soak, people turned to alternatives: washing with cloths, changing linen frequently, rubbing herbs like rosemary, lavender, or sage into skin and hair. It was not about laziness or ignorance. It was about survival, using the best medical reasoning they had at the time. Picture a 14th century Florentine woman writing to her sister during a plague outbreak. She might complain about missing the communal baths, but describe how she now relies on linen wipes and scented sachets. In her world, cleanliness meant not just physical comfort, but a layer of protection from invisible dangers. In fact, medical advice at the time often linked cleanliness to moral and spiritual health, urging people to wash hands and faces before meals, to keep homes tidy, and to wear fresh clothes. And speaking of clothes, let us pause there. We often forget that for medieval people, changing into a fresh set of linen was itself considered a form of bathing. Linen was absorbent and could wick away sweat and dirt. Washing the linen regularly meant that the body stayed fresher too. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a quick shower, without needing to draw a tub of water every day. Now let us address another layer of the myth. Perfume. Popular culture tells us medieval nobles drowned themselves in heavy scents to cover the stench of unwashed bodies. While perfumes and scented oils did exist, they were not simply odor cover-ups. They were luxury goods, symbols of wealth and refinement, often imported through long trade routes. A noble woman wearing rose water was not saying, "I smell terrible, but at least this will hide it." She was saying, "I have the means to afford beauty and rarity." Perfume was closer to a status symbol, much like designer fragrances are today. Of course, we should not romanticize it either. Medieval towns could be dirty places. Streets often doubled as sewers. Animals wandered freely. Waste disposal was rudimentary. But we need to separate urban sanitation issues from personal hygiene habits. Even in messy environments, individuals cared about washing, grooming, and presenting themselves decently. Archaeological finds show combs, tweezers, and even early forms of toothbrushes or toothpicks among everyday belongings. Clearly, appearance and hygiene mattered to people. Here's another fascinating twist. Bathing was not just about hygiene, it was also social. Bathhouses were places of relaxation, conversation, sometimes even matchmaking. A merchant might close a deal over a soak. A traveling pilgrim might recover from the road in warm water. In some cities, bathhouses even served meals to guests. If this all sounds surprisingly modern, well, that is the point. Medieval life had layers of normalcy and comfort that our stereotypes erase. And yes, there were debates about morality. Some bathhouses gained reputations for doubling as places of illicit activity. This moral suspicion sometimes led church leaders or city officials to regulate or even shut them down. Over time, especially during disease outbreaks and waves of stricter religious control, the bathhouse tradition declined in parts of Europe, but for many centuries it was vibrant and common. Let us bring this into perspective with a real story. In 13th century Paris, bathhouses were so popular that city records mention complaints about the shortage of firewood to heat them. One official report even noted that some bathhouse keepers were cutting corners, reheating the same bathwater for multiple guests, a medieval version of not exactly sanitary. That complaint alone tells us something important. People expected clean water, fresh heat, and reliable service. You do not complain about bathwater if you are not used to bathing in the first place. Another glimpse comes from England. Chronicles describe nobles taking baths scented with rose petals, servants carrying buckets of hot water up winding castle stairs, and basins being placed in chambers for personal washing. In royal courts, cleanliness became a mark of civility. Being well-groomed was not optional. It was part of maintaining status and respect. So why do we still imagine the Middle Ages as centuries of filth? Much of it comes down to how later generations told the story. In the 19th century, writers looking to emphasize modern progress exaggerated medieval backwardness. Popular fiction added layers of mud, grime, and exaggeration for dramatic effect. Movies and TV shows, seeking instant atmosphere, often paint peasants as permanently dirt-covered. And so the myth hardened, 1,000 years without soap. But when we strip away the exaggeration, a more balanced picture emerges. Medieval people were neither spotless nor hopelessly filthy. They adapted hygiene to their circumstances, their beliefs, and their resources. They bathed in rivers, tubs, and public bathhouses. They washed with linens and herbs. They combed their hair, brushed their teeth, trimmed their nails. They may not have had antibacterial hand gel, but they certainly were not indifferent to cleanliness. The real lesson here is simple. People of the past were not caricatures. They faced the same daily concerns we do: how to stay comfortable, how to present themselves, how to avoid illness. They did their best with the knowledge they had. And just like us, they balanced convenience, cost, and culture in deciding how often to bathe or how much perfume to wear. So next time someone jokes, "In the Middle Ages they never bathed," you will know how to respond. You can smile and say, "Actually, they bathed plenty. Sometimes in public bathhouses, sometimes with herbs and linens, sometimes in private tubs." The story of 1,000 years of stink is more myth than fact. And that realization is not just trivia, it is a reminder of how easily stereotypes distort our vision of history. When we take the time to ask better questions, we uncover a Middle Ages that looks a lot less like a swamp of ignorance and a lot more like a mirror, showing people who cared about dignity, health, and comfort, just like us. So, now that we have rinsed away the myth of the dirty Middle Ages, let us step into another tale that has clung to the popular imagination for centuries: the infamous chastity belt. You have probably seen it in movies, cartoons, or satirical sketches. A heavy iron contraption strapped around a woman's waist, locked with a giant padlock, supposedly to keep her pure while her husband was off at war or crusade. It is a striking image, part shocking, part absurd, and completely unforgettable. And maybe that is why this myth stuck so hard. But here's the truth. Those iron belts, as they are usually presented, were not medieval inventions. Let us rewind. In real medieval records, there is almost no credible evidence of widespread use of chastity belts. The few so-called artifacts on display in some museums often turned out to be fakes from the 18th or 19th century, built during an age obsessed with both moral panic and sexual satire. Some were even created as practical jokes or cautionary curiosities, not as real tools of control. Think of it this way. If you have ever seen a cartoon drawing of a chastity belt with a key the size of a sword, or designs so impractical they would make walking, sitting, or even basic hygiene impossible, that was the point. They were exaggerations meant to shock, amuse, or moralize. Imagine Victorian audiences in the 1800s giggling nervously at an iron contraption in a cabinet of curiosities. It said more about their anxieties than about medieval daily life. But myths have power because they tap into something deeper. The chastity belt myth survives because it fits neatly with the stereotype of the Middle Ages as a time of repression, ignorance, and cruelty, especially toward women. It is a ready-made story: jealous husbands, helpless wives, patriarchy enforced with steel. The problem is, history shows us something more nuanced. Of course, medieval society was patriarchal. Women's freedoms were limited in many ways, and gender inequality was real. But locking women in cages of iron, that is largely fantasy. In reality, women's chastity was guarded by social norms, religious teaching, family structures, and surveillance within communities. A young woman's behavior was shaped by expectations, not hardware. There is another layer here worth considering: how myths evolve over time. The chastity belt became a kind of cultural symbol, passed down not because it was true, but because it was useful to later storytellers. Renaissance artists sometimes included satirical sketches of ridiculous belts as commentary on jealousy or sexual paranoia. Centuries later, Victorian writers used them as props in moralistic tales, painting the Middle Ages as grotesque so they could present their own age as more civilized, even though Victorian society had its own contradictions around morality and sexuality. Let us pause and picture an actual medieval woman, not the caricature in iron shackles, but a person of flesh and blood. Maybe she is the wife of a merchant in 14th century Bruges. Her husband travels for weeks on trade routes, leaving her to manage the household, keep accounts, and supervise apprentices. Her chastity belt is not made of iron, but of expectations, gossip, and the very real consequences if she broke the trust of her community. This does not excuse inequality, but it is worlds apart from the cartoonish image of padlocked underwear. Here's a telling detail. If chastity belts had truly been common, we would expect to see them mentioned in sermons, legal records, medical manuals, or court cases, yet they are virtually absent. What we do see are references to moral warnings, virginity as virtue, and the social enforcement of marriage contracts. Words, not metal, were the real tools of control. One of the few times we do see chastity belts pop up authentically in the medieval imagination is in literature and satire, not reality. Poets and playwrights might joke about jealous husbands, or the absurdity of trying to control desire with chains. The humor only works if the audience already sees the idea as over the top. That alone should tell us something. So why does this myth matter? Because the chastity belt is not just a quirky falsehood. It shapes how we view an entire era, especially the role of women. If we imagine women literally locked away, we miss the fuller picture. Women running markets, managing estates, weaving in guilds, even ruling as regents. Their restrictions were real, but they were social, economic, and religious, not mechanical. The myth flattens them into passive victims, when in reality, their lives were complex and active. And here's where I would like to add a modern reflection. Think about how quickly we latch onto shocking images today. A meme, a viral tweet, a dramatic headline. The chastity belt myth spread the same way. Once you have seen that mental picture, an iron cage strapped to a woman's waist, it is hard to forget. But memorable does not always mean accurate. Sometimes it means catchy. Sometimes it means weaponized. The chastity belt is a medieval myth-tailer made for clickbait before the internet even existed. Now, let me share a real example of how the myth continues to ripple. In the 19th century, a German museum proudly displayed a genuine medieval chastity belt. Visitors whispered and stared, horrified and fascinated. Decades later, scholars examined it closely and realized the locks and ironwork were from centuries later. The artifact was likely forged or assembled as a spectacle. Yet by then, the damage was done. The belt had already cemented itself in people's imagination as something medieval. So here's the takeaway. When you hear someone laugh about those silly medieval men locking up their wives, you can gently say, actually, that image comes more from Victorian anxieties than from medieval reality. You will sound smart, and you will also be helping rescue the real complexity of women's lives in history from the rusted cage of a myth. Because the truth is always more interesting. Real medieval relationships were messy, human, and filled with negotiation, just like relationships today. They had jealousy, loyalty, betrayal, and love. But they did not involve walking around with a pound of iron strapped to your waist. That is the invention of later centuries, projected backward to make the past look crueler than it was. As we leave behind the myth of the chastity belt, notice the pattern forming. First, we saw how the flat earth story exaggerated ignorance. Then, we saw how bathing myths exaggerated filth. And now, we see how chastity belts exaggerated repression. These myths survive because they simplify. They give us dramatic images we can easily pass around. But by peeling them back, we find something far richer. A past that was flawed, yes, but also human, complicated, and surprisingly relatable. And that is the journey we are on tonight, turning legends inside out, looking for the humanity underneath. So, take a breath. We have washed off the dirt, unlocked the chains, and now we are ready to step into another colorful revelation about the Middle Ages. Because contrary to the mud and misery stereotype, the next part of our story is about vivid colors, quite literally. We have just unlocked the myth of the chastity belt, and in doing so, revealed how later centuries loved to exaggerate repression and control. Now let us swing open another door in the medieval house of myths. This time, a door painted not gray or brown, but with vibrant colors, because here's another story you have probably absorbed without realizing. Life in the Middle Ages was dull, dirty, and colorless, just mud, burlap, and shadows. Think about how movies usually show it. If it is a medieval village, the screen is washed in sepia tones. Everyone wears the same earth-colored tunic. The houses look like mud huts. The only color is the flicker of a torch or the splash of blood in battle. Directors use this palette to signal the Dark Ages, and because we have seen it again and again, we imagine it must be true. But history, once more, is far brighter than the myth. Let us step into a real medieval festival square. It is May Day in a Flemish town around the 15th century. The market stalls are draped with cloth dyed in saffron yellow and indigo blue. Children wear garlands of fresh flowers. Streamers flutter from wagon poles. Painted shields gleam in the sun, and drummers beat a steady rhythm while dancers swirl in embroidered dresses. The air smells of roasted meat, honey cakes, and herbs. The scene is bursting with color, sound, and energy about as far as you can get from the muddy movie version. Where does this misconception come from? partly from survival bias. What lasts through centuries? Stone ruins, faded manuscripts, scraps of fabric long drained of dye. By the time archaeologists dig up a cloth, its once bright crimson may look brown. By the time we look at weathered church walls, the original painted murals have chipped away. But if you could roll back the centuries, cathedrals were once painted in vivid reds, golds, and blues. Statues of saints gleamed with color. Even ordinary homes sometimes had painted beams, dyed linens, and bright pottery. Clothing tells the story too. Dyes were made from plants, insects, and minerals, producing a surprising spectrum. Yellows from weld, blues from woad, reds from madder or cochineal, purples from lichens, and blacks from oak galls. Some colors were more expensive than others. Bright scarlet or deep blue were prized luxury shades. But even peasants had access to earth-friendly dyes that gave greens, yellows, and softer blues. Farmers might work in undyed wool, yes, but on feast days they pulled out their best tunics, often patterned or brightly tinted. Let us pause with a real-life example. In York, England, archaeologists discovered fragments of medieval clothing in waterlogged pits. To everyone's surprise, chemical analysis revealed traces of bright dyes. These were not noblemen's cloaks. They were everyday garments from working people. Clearly, life was not all gray. Another example comes from Italian frescoes. When artists painted peasants, they often included splashes of color on their clothes, reds, greens, blues, because that is what they saw around them. Color also carried meaning. Red could symbolize wealth or passion. Blue, especially when made with expensive imported pigments, was reserved for paintings of the Virgin Mary. Signaling reverence, green was linked to youth, growth, and sometimes even mischief. Black could signify both solemnity and elegance. The medieval world read colors almost like we read emojis today. Subtle signals of identity, mood, and status. Festivals turned this love of color into spectacle. Imagine a Corpus Christi procession in a Spanish town. Clergy carrying banners stitched in gold thread, children scattering flower petals, floats painted with biblical scenes, and townsfolk watching in their Sunday best. Or think of a knightly tournament in France. Tents striped in bright cloth, shields painted with heraldic designs, armor gleaming, horses draped in patterned caparisons. These were not events in sepia. They were explosions of color. But why does the muddy myth persist? Partly because of art history. Renaissance artists, eager to present themselves as innovators, often painted the Middle Ages as crude and plain in comparison to their rebirth of beauty. Later, 19th century romantics doubled down, romanticizing ruins and shadows. And finally, Hollywood adopted a mud filter to make medieval dramas look gritty and real. Ironically, it is our modern color choices, desaturated films, brown costumes, that create the illusion of a colorless past. Let us not forget personal expression. Jewelry, embroidery, and even hairstyles added to the palette of everyday life. Peasant women braided ribbons into their hair. Merchants' wives wore brooches with enamel colors. Guild members carried banners painted with their trade emblems. Even taverns had painted signs so customers could find them without being able to read. Here's another vivid story. In a small German town in the late 14th century, a scribe recorded the expenses for a wedding feast. Among the items listed were not only food and drink, but also ribbons in red and green for decorating the hall, and powdered gold to sprinkle on the bride's headdress. Imagine walking into that hall, wooden tables groaning with food, musicians playing, walls hung with cloths in festive shades, candlelight bouncing off metallic threads. Far from drab, it would have been dazzling. And there is one more point worth making. Color was not just decoration, it was emotional. Bright clothes and banners created joy in hard times. After surviving a harsh winter or a wave of illness, people celebrated life with feasts and parades. The colors were not trivial. They were a form of resilience, a way to push back against the grayness of survival. So next time you picture the Middle Ages as endless mud, remember the archaeology, the records, the art, and the festivals. Yes, there was dirt in the streets. Yes, people wore brown wool while farming. But when the moment called for it, they dressed the world in color. They wove vibrancy into fabric, painted stories onto walls, and carried bright banners into their streets. Life was not a monochrome misery. It was a shifting spectrum of light and shadow, just like ours today. And here's the larger lesson. When we reduce the past to mud and burlap, we rob it of its humanity. People then, just like now, loved beauty. They wanted to express themselves. They wanted to mark special moments with splashes of color. They were not living in a movie set with a gray filter. They were alive, and they wanted the world around them to feel alive too. So we have now swept away 3 big myths: the flat earth, the filthy, unwashed body, and the iron belt. And we have repainted the Middle Ages in brighter, truer tones. But our journey does not stop here, because the next myth takes us out of the marketplace and onto the road. Legend says that medieval peasants never traveled beyond their village, that they lived and died within sight of the same hedgerow. But is that really the case? Let us find out. We have already seen how the world of the Middle Ages was more colorful than the faded images left to us by ruins and Hollywood, the filters. But color was not the only surprise. Another stubborn belief is that medieval people lived their entire lives chained to one tiny village, never venturing farther than a few miles from their birthplace. The stereotype goes like this: peasants staring suspiciously across the hedgerow, nobles locked inside their castles, everyone trapped in a stagnant world with no curiosity about what lay beyond. It is an image of isolation, of people rooted like trees, waiting for the Renaissance or the age of exploration to finally shake them free. Yet the reality, as usual, is far more dynamic, and once you step into it, you will find a medieval Europe constantly in motion. Picture yourself in a small English village around the year 1300. It is harvest season, and yes, the fields are busy, but look closer. A group of young men and women are packing bundles because they are leaving for seasonal work in another region, following the demand for labor after a poor crop. Down the road, a peddler arrives with a cart full of trinkets and spices, telling stories of towns many miles away. In the church square, notices are posted about an upcoming fair in a neighboring county, promising merchants, musicians, and even exotic animals. This village is no closed bubble. It is a hub in a network of movement. Pilgrimage alone shattered the myth of immobility. From Canterbury to Santiago de Compostela, from Rome to Cologne, millions of ordinary people took to the roads during the Middle Ages. Pilgrimage was both spiritual and social, offering salvation for the soul and adventure for the body. Travelers collected badges and souvenirs, stayed in monasteries, swapped tales with strangers, and sometimes returned with new songs, recipes, or even marriages. Imagine a farmer saving for years to walk hundreds of miles to a holy site, carrying only a staff and a small satchel, meeting people from France, Spain, or even farther afield. Their world might have been physically smaller than ours, but their networks of contacts stretched wide, and pilgrimage was not the only form of travel. Markets and fairs pulled people from surrounding regions. A peasant might never sail across the sea, but they might easily walk 20 miles to sell surplus grain or buy cloth. Entertainers, minstrels, and craftsmen moved from town to town, looking for audiences and patrons. Scholars packed up and traveled to universities in Paris, Bologna, or Oxford. Merchants joined caravans, tracing routes across the Alps, down to Venice, or up to the Baltic. Even ordinary disputes or legal matters could force travel, being summoned to court, paying taxes, or answering to a lord in another town. War, too, moved people around. Armies on the march were made not only of knights, but also of cooks, smiths, washerwomen, and children, trailing along. Crusades drew thousands out of Europe, through Constantinople, and into the Middle East. Along the way, cultures collided, goods were exchanged, and some travelers never returned. This mobility reshaped languages, diets, and even fashion. Spices from Asia found their way into European kitchens. Silk influenced local weaving. Ideas from Arabic science and philosophy filtered into European classrooms. To call this world isolated is to miss the currents of exchange flowing constantly. Of course, not everyone was a traveler. Some people really did spend most of their lives within a narrow radius, especially the poorest farmers tied by obligation to their land. Danger, expense, and obligation could keep movement limited. Bandits, bad roads, and sickness were real risks, but even they were not as motionless as the myth suggests. Tax collectors came to villages, troubadours passed through, soldiers requisitioned supplies, outsiders arrived, and locals went out, even if only occasionally. The village was not a sealed box, it was a node in a web. Records back this up. Archaeologists have found pilgrim badges buried in remote corners of Europe, proof that someone carried them home after long journeys. Court rolls mention peasants appearing miles from their villages. Merchants' account books record peasants buying imported goods. Even architecture tells the story. Romanesque churches in rural places copied styles seen hundreds of miles away, showing ideas moving faster than we think. Why then do we cling to the idea of immobile peasants? Again, part of the answer lies in later centuries. Enlightenment thinkers like to portray the Middle Ages as a time of ignorance, where only the Renaissance opened the world. Nationalist historians in the 19th century, too, wanted to emphasize stability, rootedness, and peasant loyalty to land as part of building tidy national stories. Hollywood films later borrowed that imagery, showing villagers staring wide-eyed at the arrival of a stranger, as if they would never seen an outsider before. The truth is, medieval people were used to movement. They might be cautious, they might gossip about strangers, but they were not clueless about the wider world. Think of a 14th century German peasant who had never left his valley, yet still wore a belt dyed with imported indigo, ate pepper on feast days, and listened to a wandering minstrel sing a song, first composed in Provence. He had not left his village, but the world had come to him, and many others did leave. The widow might remarry in another town. A young apprentice might travel to a city guild. A second son, with no land to inherit, might set off as a mercenary or a pilgrim. Women as well as men moved. Records of market women show them walking miles to sell their produce. Even children were part of mobility, placed in other households as servants or learners. So the next time you hear someone claim, people in the Middle Ages never traveled, you can imagine that pilgrim trudging toward Compostela, that merchant sailing toward Bruges, that student debating in Paris, or that farmer at a bustling fair, and smile. The reality is more interesting. A world not frozen but flowing, not walled in but connected by roads, rivers, and seas. This matters because it changes how we think about history. If we believe medieval life was static, we assume progress only arrived later, with explorers and industrialists. But if we recognize the mobility of the Middle Ages, we see continuity, human beings always seeking, always moving, always curious. The same impulse that sends us today across airports and highways was alive centuries ago on dirt paths and sea lanes. And maybe there is a lesson for us too. The myth of immobility is comforting because it makes our world feel so advanced by comparison. But the truth reminds us that curiosity, travel, and exchange are deeply human. They did not begin with us. They have always been part of who we are. From the round earth to the bathhouse, from the locked belt to the painted festival square, and now to the open road, the picture of the Middle Ages grows richer and more alive. And our journey continues, because after looking at how people moved, we will now look at how long they lived. The next myth insists that medieval life expectancy was just 30 years, that people grew old at 20 and collapsed by 35. But is that really what the numbers mean? Let us dig deeper. We have walked the medieval roads and seen how people traveled more than the myths suggest. But now we arrive at one of the most persistent numbers attached to the Middle Ages, the claim that life expectancy was only about 30 years. The way it is usually presented makes it sound as if people reached their 30th birthday, sighed heavily, and then fell into the grave. This single statistic has haunted our imagination, reinforcing the idea that medieval life was nasty, brutish, and short. But just like the myths of flat earth, filth, iron belts, and colorless villages, this too is a distortion born from misunderstanding averages and ignoring context. Let us step carefully into the numbers. When historians say the average life expectancy at birth was about 30 years, they mean just that, an average, dragged downward by the brutal reality of infant and child mortality. Babies were fragile, vulnerable to disease, poor sanitation, accidents, and limited medical knowledge. Many never saw their first birthday. Many toddlers never made it past 5. Every family carried grief, sometimes burying more children than they raised. This constant shadow warped the statistics, because if half of the children died young, the overall life expectancy number plummeted, even if adults often lived far longer. Picture a small village family in the 14th century. The first 2 children die in infancy. The third survives into adulthood, marries, and lives to 60. If you average all 3 siblings, the life expectancy looks like 20 years, but the survivor lived a full life by any measure. That is the paradox of medieval averages. The numbers hide the survivors. Once someone passed the dangerous threshold of early childhood, their chances improved dramatically. Many reached their 50s, 60s, and even 70s. In some cases, well-fed nobles and resilient peasants alike could grow old enough to see grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. Monastic records often mention abbots or monks living into their 70s. Cemetery studies reveal bones with signs of age-related wear, arthritis, tooth loss, healed fractures. These were not the bodies of people who dropped dead at 30. They were bodies that carried decades of life. A monk in a 14th century English monastery, for example, left letters and account records well into his 60s, dealing with property management and correspondence. His life was punctuated by plague outbreaks, famines, and political change, yet he remained active and respected. On the other end of society, chronicles sometimes mention peasant elders being consulted for wisdom, their age noted with respect, their presence proof that long lives were possible. Now, of course, not everyone had equal chances. Nutrition mattered enormously. A poor harvest could devastate the vulnerable, while nobles with access to preserved food and imported goods fared better. Women faced unique risks, childbirth was perilous, and many women died giving life. Yet, again, once women survived those dangerous years of childbearing, they too could live long lives. Widow records show women managing households well into later decades. So where did the myth of 30-year-olds dropping dead come from? Partly from misreading the statistics, partly from the appeal of dramatic storytelling. It is easier to say people died at 30 than to explain infant mortality curves and survivor bias. It fits the gloomy narrative of the Dark Ages, but it ignores evidence written in bones, manuscripts, and family records. And when we repeat it, we unconsciously strip medieval people of the dignity of longevity. Imagine how distorted our own world would look if future historians judged us only by our average statistics. If they read that the average life expectancy in a poor region today is 45, they might assume no one lived beyond that age, even though many in the same region live into their 80s. We would protest the unfairness. Medieval people deserved the same correction. Let us add texture with a real story. In Italy, a wealthy merchant named Datini, living in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, left behind thousands of letters and documents. He lived into his 70s, still writing business correspondence, still worrying about accounts. His long life was not miraculous. It was one of many examples of survival past the mythical 30. Even outside the elite, gravestones and parish records occasionally note peasants and artisans reaching 50, 60, and beyond. Another layer, medieval society actually recognized stages of life well past 30. They had words for youth, prime, middle age, and old age. They composed advice literature for people in their 50s. Physicians wrote about the diet suitable for the elderly. None of this would make sense if people universally dropped dead before 40. They expected some to grow old, and they prepared for it. But the myth persists because it is catchy, and because it plays into our desire to feel advanced. We hear life expectancy 30 and pat ourselves on the back for living twice as long, forgetting that the difference lies not just in medicine, but in infant survival rates. Vaccinations, sanitation, antibiotics. These are modern miracles. But the Middle Ages were not populated entirely by short-lived, weary people. They laughed, aged, worked, and mourned, just like we do. Here's the deeper lesson. When we misread statistics, we misread humanity. Numbers can obscure as much as they reveal. They can reduce people to averages, erasing the resilience and variety of individual lives. By looking closer, we not only honor the truth of history, but also sharpen our awareness of how data works in our own time. Next time someone says medieval people only lived to 30, you can answer, actually, that number reflects high infant mortality. If you survived childhood, you had a good chance of living to 50 or 60, sometimes even longer. And that matters, because it transforms how we imagine the past. It was not a world where people sprinted toward an early grave. It was a world where life was risky, yes, but also enduring, where old age existed, where grandparents told stories, where experience carried weight. As we close this part of our journey, notice the pattern forming again. Myths flatten, but reality complicates. The Middle Ages were not a cartoon of short, dirty lives. They were a human era of survival and longevity amid hardship. And now, with this myth unwrapped, we are ready to move into another misunderstood corner of medieval life, their medicine. Because if people could live longer than we imagine, then the next question is how they manage their health. Were medieval doctors really just bleeding people with leeches, or is there more to the story? Let us find out. So if people in the Middle Ages could live longer than the myth suggests, the next logical question is, how did they take care of their health? Were they really just a world of superstition and bloodletting, where every illness was met with a leech and a prayer? That is the version we often see in jokes and dramas. But once again, reality is more layered. Medieval medicine was not modern, but it was not mindless either. It was a blend of inherited ancient knowledge, observation, trial and error, religious belief, and sometimes surprising innovation. Imagine you have fallen ill in a town around the year 1250. Your stomach aches, you have got a fever, and you are worried. What are your options? If you are wealthy, you might summon a physician trained at a university. He arrives with a small leather case of instruments, copies of Galen's and Hippocrates, texts, and maybe translations of Arabic medical treatises that had recently made their way into Europe. He listens to your description, checks your pulse, examines your urine in a glass vial held up to the light, and then prescribes a mixture of herbs or a special diet. If you are poorer, you might consult a local healer, perhaps an elderly woman who knows the properties of plants from long tradition. She brings you an infusion of chamomile for calming, garlic for fighting infection, or honey for a wound. You might also visit a monastery infirmary, where monks provide not only prayer, but also clean bedding, food, and sometimes surprisingly effective treatments. What emerges from this picture is not a uniform system, but a spectrum of care. Let us talk about surgery, because that surprises people most. We imagine medieval surgery as brutal hacking, but the records show more precision than we give credit for. Surgeons could remove bladder stones, set broken bones, perform amputations, and even attempt cataract surgery on the eye, using a long needle to push the cloudy lens aside. Was it risky? Absolutely. Was it always successful? Of course not. But it was not random guesswork. It was skill, practiced under difficult conditions. Archaeological evidence shows bones that healed after being set, meaning the patient lived for years afterward. Trepanning, or drilling into the skull, has left healed marks on some skeletons, proof that the patient survived. That tells us that medieval surgeons were not butchers. They were craftsmen, navigating the limits of their time. What about anesthesia? Obviously, they did not have modern gas or injections, but they did experiment with mixtures, sleeping potions made of opium derivatives, hemlock or mandrake root, applied as drinks or sponges held under the nose. Risky, yes, but sometimes enough to dull pain and allow a procedure. There are even accounts of surgeons instructing assistants to recite prayers or lullabies to calm patients, a reminder that healing was as much psychological as physical. Hygiene is another area where the myth distorts reality. No, they did not have sterile gloves or disinfectant, but some medical texts did recommend washing hands, boiling instruments, or using clean bandages. Monasteries often maintained relatively clean infirmaries compared to the outside world. In fact, when we compare medieval care to hospitals in later centuries, it is surprising how organized some of them were. Patients had beds, attendants, and records. The modern idea of a hospital owes something to these medieval institutions. Let us add a real story to bring it alive. In 12th century Cordoba, a physician named Abbas ibn Firnas wrote about surgical procedures and treatments influenced by earlier Islamic scholars. One case describes a patient with eye troubles, likely cataracts. The physician used herbal compresses to prepare, then attempted a surgical intervention. The patient regained partial sight enough to function. Imagine being that patient, expecting nothing but darkness, then suddenly seeing blurred outlines of faces again. Not a miracle cure, but evidence of practical knowledge. Another example comes from England, where medical recipes survive listing ingredients like sage, fennel, and honey for wounds, or vinegar and garlic for infections. Modern science has since confirmed that honey has antibacterial properties and garlic can fight microbes. In other words, not everything was superstition. Some remedies had real value. Of course, not all treatments worked. Bloodletting was common, based on the ancient theory of balancing humors. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Physicians believed illness came from imbalance, so bleeding a patient or prescribing purges was thought to restore harmony. Sometimes it weakened the patient more than it helped. Astrology, too, guided decision surgery might be scheduled according to the position of the moon. These practices remind us that medicine was entangled with belief systems. But even here there is a lesson. People were not passive. They were using the best framework available, testing ideas, recording results, and refining over time. What fascinates me is how medicine crossed cultural borders. During the Crusades, European doctors encountered Arabic medical knowledge, much of it based on translations of Greek texts enriched with new discoveries. Hospitals in the Middle East were often more advanced, and European scholars brought back ideas. That exchange slowly improved European medicine, showing how travel, war, and cultural contact shaped healthcare. Once again, the myth of isolation crumbles. Why does this matter? Because the myth of medieval medicine as pure barbarism makes us feel smug. We look at our sterile hospitals and think, they knew nothing, we know everything. But the truth is more humbling. We are building on centuries of trial, error, and curiosity. The medieval surgeon with his needle, the nun boiling herbs, the Arab physician studying anatomy, they were all part of the chain that eventually led to our modern operating rooms. Dismissing them as quacks blinds us to our debt to their courage and persistence. So next time you hear someone scoff, in the Middle Ages they treated everything with leeches, you can answer, actually, they performed surgeries, used herbal remedies, and ran hospitals. Some practices failed, but some were surprisingly effective. It is not about glorifying the past, but about restoring balance, seeing people not as caricatures, but as learners in a long human experiment. And here's the broader reflection. Medicine reveals how people everywhere try to wrestle with suffering. Whether in a medieval infirmary or a modern clinic, the impulse is the same. Alleviate pain, prolong life, give comfort. That shared impulse connects us across centuries. It makes the Middle Ages less foreign and more familiar. With this myth unwrapped, we can step into the next chamber of misunderstanding. What about the places we imagine medieval people lived? The castles. Cold, dark, miserable prisons of stone, according to movies. But were they really the eternal dungeons we picture, or something more complex, symbols of power, but also homes, hubs of culture, and surprisingly adapted spaces? Let us open that door next. So after walking through medieval medicine and discovering that people were not as helpless as the myths suggest, let us step inside one of the most iconic images of the Middle Ages, the castle. Popular imagination paints these fortresses as cold, dark, and miserable prisons of stone, where lords and ladies shivered in damp corridors, surrounded by rats and gloom. Hollywood loves to show castles as endless dungeons, full of drafty halls and dripping ceilings. But once again, that picture is only half the truth. Castles were many things at once: fortresses, symbols of power, administrative centers, and yes, homes. And like all homes, people adapted them to make life as comfortable as possible, even with the limitations of the time. Imagine approaching a 13th century castle on a hill. Its gray walls rise above the landscape, intimidating to attackers but reassuring to villagers who look to it for protection. As you pass through the gates, the first impression may indeed be stone and shadow. But step further in, and you begin to notice details. Colorful banners hang from the walls. Tapestries cover not only for decoration, but also for insulation, trapping warmth and brightening rooms. Candles and torches throw flickering light across carved wooden furniture. In the great hall, long tables are set for a feast, with roasted meats, spiced wine, and music filling the air. Yes, the walls are stone, but the life within them is far from lifeless. One persistent myth says castles were unbearably cold. It is true that stone walls retained chill, and winters could be harsh, but people adapted with layers of clothing, heavy wool, furs, and constant fire. The great hearth in the main hall was not just a symbol, it was the beating heart of daily life. Families and servants gathered close, warming hands and sharing stories. Bedrooms had braziers for heat, and people slept under multiple blankets or even fur coverings. Comfort was relative, but no one simply froze in silence. They layered, huddled, and managed, just as people in drafty houses still do today. Another myth. Castles were only places of war. In reality, most of the time they were administrative centers and homes. From inside those walls, lords managed estates, collected taxes, held courts, and planned trade. Kitchens buzzed with activity. Stables housed horses. Courtyards hosted training for knights, but also games for children. Music echoed in halls. Visitors came and went, and artisans crafted items for both use and display. A castle was not a dungeon, but a living community, often housing hundreds of people, from nobles to servants. Let us not forget the artistry. Many castles were decorated far more lavishly than the bare ruins suggest today. Murals painted on walls, stained glass windows glowing with light, tiled floors with intricate patterns. What we see now, Greystone was once vibrant, just as faded church walls trick us into imagining a colorless Middle Ages. Bare castle ruins trick us into thinking they were lifeless. But archaeology and records tell another story. Here's a glimpse into daily life. In the morning, servants would stoke fires and prepare meals. Children of nobles studied reading, music, or swordplay, while ladies managed household accounts and textile production. Lords held audiences, settled disputes, and trained in martial skills. Evenings brought feasts with musicians, storytellers, and sometimes traveling performers. Far from endless silence, castles echoed with human voices, laughter, and the daily rhythm of work and leisure. We also need to remember that castles were not isolated from the wider community. Villages clustered nearby, markets formed around the walls, peasants brought goods and labor. The castle was not just a family's fortress. It was the administrative center for an entire region. Decisions made in its halls affected hundreds of people. In times of danger, Villagers might seek refuge within its walls, turning it into a lifeboat of survival. Yet, we should not romanticize either. Castles were symbols of power, and sometimes oppression. They could dominate landscapes, not just to protect, but to control. The same walls that sheltered also intimidated. Taxes were collected under those roofs, justice was dispensed, and rebellions were crushed. Castles remind us of the dual nature of medieval power, both protective and coercive. Let us bring in a real example. In 14th century England, the Castle of Kenilworth was not just a fortress, but a site of lavish entertainment. Records describe elaborate banquets with musicians, exotic dishes, and even mock naval battles staged on its artificial lake. Guests marveled at fireworks and pageants. Does that sound like a dark dungeon? It sounds closer to a medieval version of a luxury resort mixed with a political stage. On the other hand, smaller castles were simpler stone keeps with modest decoration. Even there, however, life was not one endless draft. People made adjustments: straw on floors for warmth, shutters on windows, hangings on walls. The myth of the miserable castle survives because ruins are persuasive. When you walk through a roofless hall today, feeling the wind whip through empty windows, you imagine that is how it always was. But you are standing in the skeleton, not the body. Roofs once stood, fires once burned, walls once gleamed with paint. Ruins are the afterlife of castles, not their living state. So what is the larger lesson? Just like with hygiene, travel, and life expectancy, the myth of the castle shows how easy it is to take what survives stone walls and mistake it for the whole truth. But the past was lived in warmth, color, sound, and adaptation. People were not content to suffer in silence. They worked with what they had to create homes. And in doing so, they left us a reminder: human beings are endlessly resourceful. So next time you picture a medieval lord shivering in a gray hall, remember instead the crackling fire, the glowing tapestry, the musicians tuning their instruments, the servants bustling, the children laughing in the courtyard. The castle was a stage of life, not a stone coffin. And with that image, let us carry our journey further into another misunderstood dimension of medieval society, the roles of women. Because if castles challenge the myth of cold stone, women's lives challenge the myth of passive silence. Were they really just powerless damsels locked in towers? Or is the truth, once again, far richer? Let us find out. After stepping through the castle halls and realizing they were not the lifeless dungeons we often imagine, it is time to look more closely at the people who lived inside and outside those walls, especially the women. One of the most stubborn myths about the Middle Ages is that women were powerless, voiceless, and locked away, either in towers waiting to be rescued or in kitchens with no role beyond serving men. The truth, as always, is more complex. Medieval society was indeed patriarchal, but women's lives were far richer and more varied than the stereotype of the silent damsel suggests. Imagine a noble woman whose husband is away at war. She is not sitting idly by the window embroidering endlessly, though embroidery was real work too. She is the acting regent, making decisions about estate finances, supervising harvests, ensuring that taxes are collected, and even resolving disputes among tenants. In his absence, she carries the authority of the household, a responsibility that could affect hundreds of lives. Some records show women sealing documents, hiring workers, and even commanding defenses if danger threatened. This was not stay-in-the-kitchen energy, it was executive multitasking. But power was not limited to noble women. In towns, widows of merchants often took over their husbands' businesses, running accounts, negotiating contracts, and trading goods across markets. Women joined guilds in certain trades, sometimes forming all-female guilds to train apprentices and control production. In textile industries, brewing, and food markets, women's hands shaped the economic pulse of towns. Peasant women, too, had active roles. They worked the fields alongside men, tended animals, brewed ale for sale, spun wool, and sold produce in markets. When famine hit, their labor could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The idea that they were confined entirely to private space is a distortion. Everyday life shows them out in the open, trading, gossiping, managing, and hustling like everyone else. Education was another area where women's presence was greater than we think. True, literacy was not universal, but it was not closed to women either. Noble women, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, were patrons of poets and readers of Latin texts. Religious women, nuns, abbesses, studied scripture, copied manuscripts, and sometimes wrote their own works. Even among ordinary women, there was what historians call partial literacy, the ability to recognize symbols, sign names, read prayers, or follow accounts. Literacy was not all or nothing. It existed in shades, and women participated in those shades. And, of course, not all women had equal opportunity. Social class, geography, and family shaped their options. Some were trapped in marriages with little say. Some faced violence and inequality that limited their freedoms. Yet to say all women were powerless erases the many who navigated, bent, and sometimes broke the rules to carve out space for themselves. A widow running a shop, a noblewoman ruling as regent, a nun writing poetry, a peasant selling beer. These were all part of the fabric of medieval life. The myth of female passivity also ignores moments of extraordinary influence. Queens like Isabella of France or Eleanor of Aquitaine wielded power that shifted the course of kingdoms. Abbesses controlled vast monastic lands and advised kings. Even women who were not formally in power could shape politics through networks, marriages, and family alliances. Sometimes their names are hidden, but their influence was real. Let us bring this closer with a real story. In 14th century Paris, a woman named Jeanne de Montfort defended her husband's duchy in Brittany while he was imprisoned. She rallied troops, commanded fortresses, and earned the nickname La Flamme for her courage. Far from powerless, she was a military leader when circumstances demanded it. Another example, Christine de Pizan, an Italian-born woman in France, became one of Europe's first professional female writers. In the early 15th century, she supported her family through her pen, writing works that defended women and challenged misogynistic ideas of her time. Her voice reached kings and courts, proving that women could speak loudly in an age supposedly silencing them. Yet even beyond these famous figures, the daily grind of ordinary women mattered. A brewer in a small English town selling ale to neighbors contributed to the local economy and carved out her independence. A mother teaching her children prayers transmitted culture. A healer tending wounds passed down knowledge. When we reduce medieval women to damsels in distress, we erase all these contributions. Why does this myth persist? Partly because later centuries like to romanticize the Middle Ages as a stage for male heroism. Knights rescuing princesses, kings commanding armies. Women were relegated to background roles in these stories. Popular culture still repeats it. Films show queens as pawns, peasant women as silent, and nuns as passive. But the record shows otherwise, and that matters because when we misrepresent women of the past, we distort the long story of gender. It is easy to think that empowerment is purely modern, that before our time women were only shadows. But history tells us empowerment existed in degrees, in spaces carved out, in compromises made. Seeing that truth honors the resilience of women across centuries. So next time someone says, women in the Middle Ages had no power, you can answer, actually, they ruled estates, ran businesses, joined guilds, and even wrote books. They were constrained, but they were not invisible. That shift matters because it restores humanity to half the population erased by stereotype. And once again, the broader pattern emerges. The myth flattens, the reality complicates. The Middle Ages were not a stage of silent damsels. They were a world of women, working, ruling, speaking, and shaping their communities. With this myth dismantled, we can step into another misconception waiting in the shadows, the idea that medieval belief was monolithic, that everyone marched in blind lockstep under the church's power. Was faith really that simple? Or was medieval belief more diverse, tangled, and surprising than the stereotype of universal obedience? Let us explore next. After peeling back the myth of silent women and finding instead a world where they managed estates, brewed ale, and even wrote books, we arrive at another of the grand stereotypes, that medieval belief was uniform, rigid, and absolute. The story goes that everyone in Europe walked in lockstep under the iron grip of the Catholic Church, obeying without question, thinking only in fear of hellfire. It is the picture of a continent hypnotized, with no room for doubt, diversity, or nuance. But belief in the Middle Ages was not a monolith. It was a patchwork quilt woven from orthodoxy, local tradition, superstition, folklore, and personal spirituality. If you stepped into a cathedral in Rome, you would see one version of faith-soaring arches, stained glass, choirs echoing with Latin chants. But if you stepped into a village in Bohemia, you might find people celebrating feast days by also leaving offerings at an old spring, a pagan ritual lingering beneath Christian layers. The church was powerful, yes, but it was not a machine stamping out identical thoughts across thousands of miles. Let us set the stage. The medieval Catholic Church was indeed the dominant institution. It controlled land, dictated calendars, influenced kings, and guided daily rhythms with feast days, saints, anniversaries, and fasts. Inquisitors traveled to enforce orthodoxy. Monasteries dotted the landscape, each a hub of prayer, study, and sometimes political influence. But to imagine that this meant everyone thought the same way is to ignore the messy reality of human belief. People blended. They carried rosaries and wore charms. They prayed to saints while whispering local folk incantations. They might light a candle in church, then tie a ribbon to a sacred tree. Religion was everywhere, but it was not everywhere the same. Take relics, for example. Relic tourism was booming. People traveled miles to see the bones of saints, drops of the Virgin Mary's milk, or pieces of the true cross. Some relics were authentic, others dubious, but all drew crowds. Pilgrims came seeking miracles, forgiveness, or simply the thrill of touching the sacred. At the same time, local folklore persisted. Villagers believed in fairies, spirits, or protective charms. For them, the line between religion and superstition blurred. It was not either or. It was both and. This blending shows up in the debates of the time. Scholars wrestled with questions of orthodoxy versus heresy. Movements like the Cathars or the Lollards challenged aspects of church teaching. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen recorded visions that mixed theology with vivid personal imagery. For some, spirituality was deeply intellectual. For others, it was visceral, embodied in rituals, songs, and objects. To flatten this into everyone believed exactly the same erases the diversity of experience. And here's where it gets interesting. Not only was belief diverse, but it was sometimes downright weird by our standards. There are accounts of holy relics being carried into battle as weapons of faith, of people selling indulgences to shave centuries off purgatory, of elaborate pilgrimages undertaken barefoot for penance. There are miracle stories that mix awe and humor, like the legend of Saint Lawrence, roasted alive on a gridiron, who supposedly quipped to his executioners, "Turn me over, I am done on this side." Medieval belief had space for the solemn and the absurd, the holy and the playful. But the myth of uniform belief persists because later storytellers wanted it to. Enlightenment thinkers painted the Middle Ages as an age of superstition, contrasting it with their own rational era. They exaggerated the Church's power to make their own age look freer. Pop culture then reinforced it, movies showing peasants cowering before priests, or villagers panicking at any sign of dissent. The nuance disappeared, replaced with a caricature. Let us bring in a real example. In rural England, church records reveal priests complaining that their flock still practiced old harvest rituals, leaving bread at springs or dancing around trees. For those villagers, Christianity did not erase old traditions, it layered on top of them. Another example. In France, pilgrims would visit a shrine for healing, but also tie ribbons to local statues for luck, a blending of official and unofficial faith. These practices were not rare exceptions. They were normal. Women, too, shaped belief. Abbesses managed convents that became centers of learning. Female mystics wrote visions that influenced theology. Ordinary women served as midwives, using both prayer and herbal charms. When we picture faith as purely male priests imposing doctrine, we miss the grassroots spirituality shaped by mothers, grandmothers, and healers. So what lesson does this give us today? That belief, like life, is always more complex than the stereotype. To say medieval people all thought the same is to erase individuality. They wrestled with doubts, blended traditions, questioned authority, and sought meaning in ways both official and unofficial. Their world was full of contradictions, deep reverence and occasional rebellion, orthodoxy and heresy, holy relics and pagan charms. And perhaps the most important takeaway is this: when we flatten their belief into blind obedience, we risk flattening our own as well, because belief in any age is rarely simple. It is shaped by culture, fear, hope, tradition, and innovation. To honor the medieval world properly is to see its faith not as a single color, but as a mosaic shimmering, fractured, and endlessly human. So next time someone shrugs and says, everyone in the Middle Ages just obeyed the church without question, you can say, not exactly. They followed, yes, but they also blended, questioned, and shaped belief in their own ways. That correction matters, because it gives back the diversity of thought to people often dismissed as mindless sheep. And with that, our journey can now turn to one of the most famous distortions of medieval religion, the myth of constant witch burnings. Were the Middle Ages really a time when every village lit bonfires to kill supposed witches? Or is that another case of history being rewritten by later fears? Let us step into the fire and see what really happened. So now that we have seen how medieval belief was far more diverse than the myth of blind obedience suggests, let us move into the shadows of one of the most dramatic and misunderstood images of the Middle Ages, the witch burning. Popular imagination insists that in medieval Europe, witches were hunted constantly, dragged to stakes in every village square, and burned by the hundreds. It is the picture of an age consumed by fear and cruelty, where superstition ran unchecked, and any woman with herbs in her apron faced the fire. But the truth is subtler, and once again, much of what we think we know belongs less to the medieval world and more to later centuries. Imagine a village in 13th century France. Rumors swirl about a woman who knows too much about plants. Someone's cow has died unexpectedly, and the locals whisper. What happens? Most likely she is gossiped about, maybe pressured, maybe called before a local priest for penance. Execution by fire? Unlikely. In fact, throughout much of the Middle Ages, accusations of witchcraft did occur, but systematic hunts and mass burnings were rare. Punishments for minor superstitions often meant confession, fines, or minor penance, not death. The image of constant bonfires lighting up the night really belongs to the late 15th through 17th centuries, when a mix of political anxiety, religious conflict, and cultural paranoia transformed suspicion into full-blown hunts. Why then do we imagine the Middle Ages as one long witch pyre? Partly because of how stories get told. The early modern witch craze was so dramatic that later historians projected it backward. Popular culture mashed centuries together into a single block called the Dark Ages, where everything frightening could be dumped, and movies needing instant atmosphere love the image of torches, terrified villagers, and sinister priests. But the reality is that for much of medieval Europe, witches were not the central obsession. In fact, early medieval theology often denied the very existence of witches in the way we imagine them. Church doctrine sometimes treated belief in witches as heresy in itself. Believing too much in the power of witches was seen as giving Satan undue credit. That is a far cry from the bonfires of legend. Of course, there were exceptions. In some regions, particularly in parts of Germany or Switzerland, localized panics did lead to executions even before the great witch hunts. And yes, fear of heresy and demons was real, and sometimes brutal, but the scale was smaller, the incidents more sporadic. More often, accusations of sorcery were tangled up with neighborly disputes, jealousy, or politics. A woman might be accused not because she cackled over a cauldron, but because she owned land someone coveted, or because her remedies challenged male authority. Think of it this way. When we picture medieval Europe with witches burning every week, we erase the broader spectrum of justice. Medieval law courts dealt with theft, property disputes, feuds, and taxes far more often than with witches. Witch trials were the outliers, not the norm. Only later, with the publication of works like the Malleus Maleficarum in the late 1400s, did witch hunting take on the fanatical shape that still haunts our imagination. That book, essentially a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches, spread like wildfire and gave legal and theological justification for hysteria. But by then, we are stepping into the early modern world, not the medieval one. So, what does this correction give us? First, it restores proportion. The Middle Ages were not a 1,000-year bonfire. They were a time when belief in magic, saints, and demons coexisted, but executions for witchcraft were limited. Second, it reminds us of how myths work. Later fears bleed backward, coloring the past darker than it was. We like tidy stories of ignorance, giving way to enlightenment. But the truth is jagged and messy. Third, it humanizes the people of the Middle Ages. They were not cartoon villagers with torches in hand at the first sneeze of a neighbor. They were communities negotiating fear, suspicion, and difference with a range of responses, sometimes harsh, often mundane. Let us bring in a real story to anchor this. In 14th century England, a woman named Alice Cateller was accused of witchcraft. The charges against her included using potions, consorting with demons, and leading a coven. It sounds like the perfect medieval witch trial, but here's the twist. Her case was tangled with property disputes and political rivalry. Alice was wealthy, independent, and powerful, a dangerous combination in any era. She fled and survived, though her maid was executed. Her story reveals how accusations often masked deeper tensions, not simple superstition. Another example comes from the Low Countries, where women who healed with herbs were sometimes accused during times of crisis, but in calmer times were respected as wise women. Context mattered. So next time someone claims that the Middle Ages were defined by endless witch burnings, you can say, not exactly. Large-scale witch hunts came later, in the early modern era. Medieval Europe was superstitious, yes, but it was not one long bonfire. That is not to excuse the real suffering that did occur, but to place it accurately in time. By doing so, we give justice to the truth, and also learn a lesson about how fear evolves. Because when societies face uncertainty, famine, plague, political instability, they often look for scapegoats. In the Middle Ages, sometimes that scapegoat was the woman with herbs, sometimes it was the outsider, sometimes it was the heretic. In our world, scapegoating still happens, only with different labels. The past warns us that fear, when mixed with authority, can ignite dangerous fires. And so, our journey continues. We have doused the myth of constant witch burnings, showing that medieval people were not endlessly torching their neighbors. Instead, they lived in a world of layered belief, occasional suspicion, and rare but real flare-ups. With that myth corrected, we can now sit down at a medieval table, because another popular story insists that the food was bland, rotten, and salvaged only by heavy spices. But is that true? Or is medieval cuisine another part of history that deserves a richer taste? Let us take a bite next. So after we have stepped away from the flames of misunderstood witch burnings, we finally arrive at the medieval dining table, because no journey through myth and reality is complete without tasting the food that sustained people's lives. And here, too, the myths have misled us. You have probably heard that medieval people lived on gruel, ate rotten meat, and drowned everything in spices to disguise the stench. It is a story that sounds believable, because we know they did not have refrigerators, but the truth, once again, is far richer and more surprising. Meat was too valuable to be wasted, and spices were too costly to be thrown at spoiled food. What really happened at the medieval table was not the desperate salvaging of rot, but a celebration of flavor, variety, and symbolism. Picture a noble feast in the 14th century. The great hall is lit by torches and filled with music. Servants bring in platters of roasted venison glazed with honey, pies stuffed with eels and seasoned with saffron, soups simmering with ginger, cinnamon, and pepper. Bowls of apples and pears are served with cheese and nuts, and goblets are filled with hippocras, a spiced wine. This is not survival gruel. This is art on the table. Spices were the jewels of the medieval pantry: cloves from the east, nutmeg and cinnamon from distant trade routes, grains of paradise carried across oceans. To serve them was to serve prestige. A sprinkling of cinnamon was a sprinkling of status, proof that your household could afford the exotic. Guests were not whispering, "Thank goodness this covers the stink." They were whispering, "This host is powerful, connected, worldly." Even peasants, though their diets were simpler, did not live on tasteless sludge. They ate pottage, hearty stews of grain and vegetables, sometimes enriched with bits of meat or cheese. They baked bread, drank ale, flavored soups with herbs like parsley, sage, or rosemary from their gardens. In coastal towns, fish was abundant, preserved by salting or smoking. On feast days, they joined in communal meals that included more exotic dishes, because celebrations were meant to taste different. Food was tied to the rhythms of the year harvests, fast days, markets, and holy days. Simplicity did not mean blandness, and the myth of a colorless, tasteless diet erases the creativity people brought to their cooking. Why, then, does the spoiled meat myth persist? Because it is easy and dramatic. Without fridges, surely everything rotted, right? But medieval people were not careless. They preserved meat with smoking, salting, drying, and pickling. They slaughtered animals in cooler months, used every part, and wasted nothing. To imagine them casually letting an ox rot is to misunderstand how precious food was. Covering decay with spice would not only fail, it would kill. They were practical and careful because survival demanded it. The myth flatters us, making us feel modern and clean compared to a caricature of the past, but the reality shows people who knew preservation better than we give them credit for. Let us bring in an example. Records from a 15th century English estate show purchases of saffron, ginger, and pepper alongside meat and fish. These were not used wastefully. They were measured with precision, appearing in recipes that layered flavors. One popular dish was almond milk sauce, flavored with ginger, poured over fish during fasts. Another was hypocras wine, sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon. These recipes tell us medieval palates were adventurous, curious, and refined. Food was not crude, it was sophisticated, and it was not just about taste. Food was art. Bread stamped with decorative seals, pies painted with saffron for golden shine, feasts staged with peacocks served in their feathers or jellies molded into castles. Dining was theater, a performance of wealth and joy. And so here, at the table, we also find our conclusion, because food tells us what life was really like. And it reminds us of what we have discovered across all 12 myths. Medieval people were not flat earthers stumbling in ignorance. They knew the earth was round. They were not filthy or lazy. They bathed, adapted, and cared for hygiene. They were not strapped in chastity belts. Those were later inventions. Their world was not colorless. It was filled with dye, banners, and festivals. They were not immobile. They traveled on pilgrimages to fairs and across continents. They did not all die at 30. Many lived into their 60s and 70s if they survived childhood. They were not helpless in medicine. They performed surgeries, brewed remedies, and built hospitals. Castles were not prisons. They were homes, vibrant with life. Women were not silent. They managed estates, ran businesses, and even wrote books. Belief was not uniform. It was a tapestry of orthodoxy, superstition, and folk tradition. Witch burnings were not constant. The great hunts came later, and food, far from bland slop, was alive with flavor, meaning, and spectacle. The larger lesson is this: myths survive because they are simple. They flatten the past into easy caricatures that make us feel superior. But reality is messy, complex, and human. Medieval people were not another species of half-formed humans. They were us curious, creative, fearful, joyful, flawed, resilient. They faced hardships we can hardly imagine, but they also laughed, celebrated, loved, and lived. To reduce them to mud, rot, and ignorance is not only inaccurate, it is unfair. When we correct the myths, we do not just learn facts, we learn humility. We realize that progress did not begin with us, that people long ago were already asking questions, making mistakes, and building lives full of meaning. So next time you hear someone dismiss the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, you will know better. You can say, actually, the Middle Ages were full of color, flavor, resilience, and humanity. The myths are shadows. The reality is richer. And that is the true gift of looking back, not to laugh at the past, but to see ourselves reflected in it. Because when we understand that they too were human, we see more clearly that we too are part of a long chain of questions, struggles, and celebrations. The past is not a dark pit behind us. It is a torch carried forward, illuminating our present. So as we push back from the medieval feast table, let us take the final lesson home. Do not underestimate the people who came before you. Don't reduce them to caricatures. Instead, honor their complexity and learn from their resilience. Because history is not a story of darkness turning to light. It is a story of humans always seeking, always creating, always finding meaning, even in the hardest times. And maybe that is the best bedtime story of all. Thank you so much for staying with me through this long journey into the myths and truths of the Middle Ages. If you enjoyed discovering these hidden details as much as I enjoyed sharing them, do not forget to like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next story. Your support helps keep this channel alive and motivated to bring history's secrets to light. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and I will see you in the next video. Good night, everyone.